This is your chair.
Okay. You want to talk to me?
Right. We're doing a documentary about climate change.
Well, this is simple science. Look, the higher CO2 levels are leading to a greening of the Earth. And so I don't, do you think that's a bad thing?
So more CO2 in the atmosphere is a good thing?
Yes, I think so. Absolutely.
Imagine a world where you can't trust science. Let me tell you about a group of men who've tried to convince you of just that. A group who wants you to doubt climate change. This is the story about how these men were promoted by the world's largest oil companies. The story of a campaign that has impacted our world forever.
Thank you for the opportunity to present the results of my research on the greenhouse effect. The global warming is now large enough that we can ascribe, with a high degree of confidence, a cause and effect relationship to the greenhouse effect.
Okay, this is from 1988. That was when a phone looked like this, the internet looked like this, and it was when the world realized that climate change had to be taken seriously.
It's what scientists call the greenhouse effect, and in the long run, it could mean devastating changes to all life on Earth. It's largely a problem of our own making. We're running out of time to find a solution.
Scientists predict a rise in temperatures that will eventually melt the polar ice caps.
Forest fires in the west. Food riots as the Sahara Desert spreads.
Hele lande vil forsvinde fra verdenskortet, fordi vi ikke kan standse drivhuseffekten.
In 1988, the UN established the climate change organization IPCC, where scientists from the whole world agreed with James Hansen. And world leaders listened.
Those who think we're powerless to do anything about this greenhouse effect are forgetting about the White House effect.
The evidence is there. The damage is being done. We can't just do nothing.
This is more than 30 years ago. Apparently, the world was ready to act on global warming. But something happened.
A doubling of the CO2 content of the atmosphere will produce a tremendous greening of planet Earth.
In the years following James Hansen's speech, critics appear on TV.
The theoretical speculations about future warming have no good scientific basis.
Critics who question climate change.
Wait a minute, this global warming thing, it sounds like a scam. Well, I think you're seeing it now. We told you this was going on.
This is one of them.
I spent most of my time in newspapers, in magazines, and on TV and radio to argue against climate action and against panic.
The economy would actually improve if we have a doubling of background greenhouse gas.
How can it improve?
Well, because we might have longer growing seasons.
I'm fairly glib, I'm fast on my feet, cool on TV, and I also do my homework.
In the years after James Hansen's speech, Jerry Taylor was hired by the think tank Cato.
My name is Jerry Taylor. I'm the Director of Natural Resource Studies here at the Cato Institute.
Cato hired people like me primarily to change public opinion, and that's what I did.
There may be some extreme events that occur down the road, and we don't know what the chances for that might be.
The climate skepticism is entirely dependent upon the promotion of doubt about the underlying science.
James Hansen at NASA thinks it's maybe 7, 10, 12, 15, 20%. Other scientists thinks it's probably more like 0.3%.
The denial about the underlying science is the critical juncture in the debate.
While Taylor takes a sip of water, meet Mark Morano.
Hold on, what if I, like...
Yeah.
So I'm looking at you? Or
Yeah,
the camera?
I'm going to be sitting there.
You'll sit there, so I'd be like...
My job essentially is covering the global warming movement and communicating to the public the latest findings.
If you look at the satellite data, we actually have had no significant warming since 1998. Actually, no warming. We've been cooling in recent years.
You had a background as a salesman. Can you just...
Yes, that was well. That was early on. I worked as a door-to-door salesman, which is actually a great background to build narratives and to meet. Now, when you only have 15, 20 seconds, you got to work on your sound bites and you got to work on you're building a narrative to a customer. That was a great training ground for being in media and communications.
Morano is Communications Director for Committee for Constructive Tomorrow, or CFACT, an organization whose focus is on communicating that climate change isn't that big a problem. So how does he do that?
I believe on a television and debate strategy, you have to make the other person defend their stupid, idiotic comments.
Bill Nye say, global warming will cause many bad weather events. And guess what? Bad weather events happen all the time.
And then I'll also go in with rapid-fire facts.
Bottom line, we've gone the longest period without a major U.S. Category 3 or larger hurricane hitting the U.S. since at least 1900, maybe the Civil War. Bottom line, new study in the journal Nature, peer-reviewed, no change in U.S.
I believe in this.
What Bill Nye just did was waste everyone's time explaining that CO2 is rising.
I believe you should crush your opponent.
Wait a minute. Are you a scientist?
I'm not a scientist, but I do play one on TV occasionally.
People don't take positions because they find themselves reasoned into those positions. They take positions that they want to take for emotional or ideological reasons, and then they mobilize their reasoning power to justify taking the positions they want to take.
And this is Jerry Taylor's recipe for doing just that.
A lot of people who don't know what to think about climate change are being told by people like me that it's a relative non-event. It's the same sort of wolf crying that the environmental movement has done from time immemorial. You know, first we were told there was a population bomb that was going to wipe out humanity, and that bomb never went off. Then we were told we were going to run out of fossil fuels and agricultural commodities. We're all going to starve. That never happened. And this is just the latest iteration of the usual story from environmentalists that if we continue to go down laissez-faire capitalist roads, we're going to blow up the planet and destroy mankind.
There's something in these pictures you can't see. It's essential to life. We breathe it out. Plants breathe it in. It's called carbon dioxide, CO2. Now some politicians want to label carbon dioxide a pollutant. Imagine if they succeed. They call it pollution. We call it life.
This TV commercial is from the think tank Competitive Enterprise Institute. And so is Myron Ebel.
It's clear that the Earth is greening. And so I don't, do you think that's a bad thing?
Competitive Enterprise Institute is a conservative American think tank, and Myron Ebel heads its Department on Energy, Climate and Environment. In this capacity, he's advised the current US administration. Myron Ebel believes the climate debate started like this.
Global warming as a political project was initiated in Sweden in the early 1980s. They needed a reason essentially to increase tax revenue. I mean, remember, I think you're aware of this in Denmark, the welfare state needs a lot of money, and it needs more and more money as it goes on.
All the climate-skeptical pundits you've just met work for interest organizations and think tanks.
Think tanks are like the arsenals for the war of ideas. They're the places where ideas are then weaponized in public policy terms, and then they are vigorously argued and promoted on Capitol Hill and on TV and radio. And so Cato was extremely influential because it was one of the largest right-of-center think tanks in the United States, still is. It had a lot of visibility because, again, invested in communications.
So Taylor is spreading climate skepticism from one of the most influential think tanks in the USA. This is what an ordinary workday looks like for him.
I would receive phone calls from columnists and journalists who were not experts in climate policy. If they wanted to know what they should think about an issue in climate policy, they would pick up the phone and call somebody who they trusted as an expert, which would be me. You would see the arguments that I forwarded being embraced by other personalities, public intellectuals and journalists and congressmen and what have you on the right. And that's kind of how you metric whether you're doing well or not.
Jerry Taylor tells us that his arguments build on calculations from researcher Patrick Michaels, also employed by Cato.
Anyone who goes around and says that carbon dioxide is responsible for most of the warming of the 20th century hasn't looked at the basic numbers.
The climate-skeptical pundits get their arguments from a group of climate-skeptical scientists. Physicist and climate scientist Fred Singer is behind the organization Science and Environmental Policy Project, SEPP. SEPP is behind the so-called Leipzig Declaration, where some 100 scientists raised doubts about global warming.
Some 100 or so climate scientists actually signed an appeal, put their names down, and warned about taking hasty steps against global warming when global warming was still a phantom problem.
The global warming is now large enough that we can...
So, on one side we have James Hansen and a lot of UN scientists. And then we have a number of scientists and pundits who say the exact opposite.
Hasn't looked at the basic numbers.
How is that possible? Naomi Oreskes, a Harvard professor, decided to investigate just that.
So in the early 2000s, the American media were presenting climate change as a big scientific debate. And that struck me as weird because none of the scientists that I knew thought it was a debate. So I decided to undertake an analysis of the peer-reviewed scientific literature. The IPCC had already stated that most of the observed warming was likely to be due to the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. So I posed the question, how many papers published in peer-reviewed scientific literature disagree with that statement?
To answer that question, Naomi Oreskes looks up research papers for global climate change. The words appear in 937 scientific papers. So Oreskes reads them all.
And what I found was none. There was no dissenting published scientific peer-reviewed literature on the basic question of whether or not man-made climate change was happening. And I'm a professional historian of science, so I thought, well, if I don't know this, then probably a lot of other people don't know it too. And so I wrote a small paper in 2004 called The Scientific Consensus on Climate Change. That paper changed my life because immediately the paper was published, I started getting hate mail, threatening phone calls, people filing complaints against me to my university, people accusing me of being a communist, a Stalinist.
Oreskes comes under huge criticism and she doesn't understand why, until she's at a conference in Germany shortly after.
Over a beer after the sessions one day, I was just chatting with some colleagues and mentioned how this very strange thing had happened to me. And one of the people there was Eric Conway. I mentioned the name of one of the people who was attacking me. And Eric said, well, Naomi, you know, there's the same person who attacked Sherry Rowland over the ozone hole. And he told me this amazing story that I knew nothing about at the time, that the scientists who had worked on the ozone hole had been the target of attacks in which people had claimed that there was no ozone hole, that the science was wrong, that the scientists were fraudulent, that the scientists were communists. All the things that I was being accused of, these great Nobel Prize-winning scientists had also been accused of. And so Eric said to me, yeah, when we get back to America, I'll send you an envelope with a bunch of stuff. So he sent me this package, arrives a few days later, and I take out these papers that he sent me. And it was like you could take out the word ozone hole and put in climate change. And you could take out the word Rowland and put in Oreskes. And otherwise, it was identical.
On a spring day in 1998, a group of men meet at the oil industry organization American Petroleum Institute. A number of oil companies are represented, companies like Exxon. Let's hear Exxon's CEO at the time explain who they are.
We are the largest private company in the world. Our company sells 8 million barrels a day of products. That's 1 billion gallons every 3 days.
Back to the American Petroleum Institute, API, where some of the biggest players in the oil industry are meeting. One of the participants is Myron Ebel.
They solicited advice because we had certain kinds of expertise that they didn't have. It was an industry effort with some help from people like me.
In documents from this meeting, you can see a clear purpose. Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand uncertainties in climate science, and when these uncertainties become part of conventional wisdom. According to the documents, Big Oil wants the public to doubt the science behind climate change. And it wasn't scientists who were invited to the meeting.
I'm not an energy analyst expert, and I'm not a climate expert. I have a certain amount of experience in translating policy into action, and I suppose that was what they are interested in.
At the meeting, a strategy is worked out. That paper was later leaked, and it shows how the oil industry plans to spread doubts about science. The strategy paper describes a national media relations program, which in 8 different ways will influence the media by recruiting and training scientists. It also explains that they will try to influence journalists. This one, John Stossel, is even mentioned in the paper.
I titled this program Chill Out because after I researched the global warming scare, that was my conclusion. We ought to just chill out.
The paper from the meeting shows the mindset of the world's largest oil companies. Despite the fact that the UN, several world leaders, and most scientists clearly point in another direction, the oil industry wants to raise doubts about the science behind climate change. The strategy paper explains how schools are to be influenced by an initiative called National Direct Outreach and Education. Many universities like Harvard regularly receive funding from private companies. This is a perfectly legal common practice at many prestigious universities. Jeffrey Supran is a PhD student. We'll join him at a film screening in 2017.
Harvard's Belfer Kennedy Center announced a screening of a film. Essentially, it tells the audience about how, for the foreseeable future, we're going to be relying on fossil fuels, how renewables are way off in the distance, not right now, not really reliable, and frankly, promoting half-truths at best about the inevitability of continued fossil fuel usage. If you're a student, if it has the imprimatur of Harvard, surely this is a reasonable film. Until we dug just a little bit beneath the surface. The academic talking heads, the ones that were presented as professors at universities, without exception, actually all have deep ties to the oil and gas industry, from consultancy relationships to running centers reliant on fossil fuel funding, to literally being on the boards of natural gas companies. The producer of the film was Shell Oil Company. The director of the film, he was a VP of an oil and gas company that's taken $300,000 from Shell Oil Company. So you see a pattern emerging here.
Episodes like the film screening prompted Jeffrey Supran to write a PhD with Naomi Oreskes as his supervisor about the connections between the oil industry and academia. Let's see what he found out. Harvard receives massive funding from several oil companies. Stanford's energy department also gets millions from the oil industry. The university denies that sponsors control its research, and on its website, the university emphasizes its academic independence. But a few lines later, it's described who really decides what research to fund. Final decision about funding is made by the management committee, which includes one person from each of the sponsors. And the main sponsor, who has a say in what research is funded, is ExxonMobil. Berkeley, birthplace of the 1968 student uprising, has an energy research center in which the oil company BP has invested millions. According to Jeffrey Supran, BP has a say in what will be researched. ExxonMobil says it funds universities to promote green technologies. And Shell tells us it wants to help solve the serious climate challenge.
Why is this a problem? I mean, if they use their money for doing some research for good, what's the problem?
When the very people, the very institutions that are supposed to be solving the climate crisis are fundamentally reliant on the industry that has the most to lose from their work, that's a pretty big conflict of interest.
Jeffrey Supran thinks that the many millions are intended to influence students, teachers, and scientists.
This strategy comes straight out of the playbook.
The API strategy paper also states, informing teachers and students about uncertainties in climate change will erect a barrier against efforts to impose Kyoto-like measures. A measure put in place to limit the emissions of CO2.
And that's why in the medical research community, there are established practices, there are established rules by which one must disclose these kinds of conflicts of interest.
Many universities used to receive millions from the tobacco industry. But in 2001, 31 universities, including Harvard, decided not to let tobacco companies sponsor health research.
We have nothing like that in energy and climate.
Back to Naomi Oreskes. We left her with a pile of papers, and this pile became the beginning of a big investigation, where she also gets hold of the strategy paper.
It was my Alice through the looking glass moment when my whole life kind of changed.
Oreskes drops everything and decides to find out who's arguing against the climate scientists. Bit by bit, she begins to understand why these pundits are so effective.
In general, they're much better at communicating than real scientists are, because real scientists are, well, I don't want to insult my colleagues, but, you know, most scientists are scientists. They like to be left alone. So you take a group of people who are intrinsically actually pretty poor at communicating, and now you put them up against professional communications, professional PR people.
Somebody who might go against me on TV or radio might know more than I do. They may be scientists, I'm not a scientist, but they're not necessarily good communicators. And if you put a poor communicator up against a good communicator, even garbage arguments tend to win out.
I started doing research to try to find out who are these people that are attacking me and why are they saying these extraordinary things about me? And that was the investigation that led to the book, Merchants of Doubt.
Merchants of Doubt, she calls the climate skeptics. But that doesn't stop the attacks. On the contrary.
So they sent out an email chain to each other talking about what they could do to get me, to discredit me. They call me all kinds of names. So in this one, they refer to me as Al Gore's groupie. A groupie, I don't think my husband would like that.
Oreskes says she's also called a communist and a Stalinist. After years of attacks, she explains it like this.
Their fear is that if you allow the government to regulate something, whatever it is, that this is a kind of invitation for the government to basically take over the economy. And once you do that, you're on your way to Soviet dictatorship.
To the right, climate change represents a complete victory for the left in its campaign to dismantle industrial society and free market capitalism and all that.
When you have a system of socialism that falls apart, there are an awful lot of unemployed practitioners who are looking for another area in which to vent their philosophy.
This is nothing more than the modern central planning state, the people who want to mastermind our economy, if you will. They're using environmental scares to get their way. That's literally and figuratively what's behind this climate scare. Not the science, not a desire to worry about polar bears or temperature. It's a way like, hey, this is a great opportunity to impose our political will by scaring the public. That's absolutely true. It's documented. That's it.
One day, something happens that will radically change Jerry Taylor's life.
I was in a debate in the early 2000s with Joe Rome. And on this TV show where we were debating, I said, look, Joe, it's been more than a decade since James Hansen testified in front of the United States Senate about global warming. We've only seen about a quarter of the warming that James Hansen says we should have seen by now. And if this continues to play out, there's no reason to think it won't. Climate change, it'll be a relative non-event. So we left the studio and went into the green room. And Joe said, did you even read James Hansen's testimony, or do you just, are these just talking points somebody wrote for you? What you're talking about here was scenario A. But he had a scenario B and a scenario C. So if you look at scenario B, you'll find that the emissions we've seen since his testimony pretty much track what he hypothesized under scenario B. And if you look at the temperature projections, they're pretty spot on. So when you go on television and you say that the models are running hot, that's complete garbage. So here's what I challenge you. We say you go back to your office and you reread Hansen's testimony and you tell me if what I'm saying isn't right. He says, or be a hack, I don't care. I said, because I'm not debating you again. I hate this kind of thing. So I went back to my office and I looked at the Hansen testimony, thinking, well, I'm not going to let Joe Robb, walk away thinking he got the better of me in the green room, right? And I read the testimony and it looked like it actually reflected what Joe had told me. So I went down the hallway to the scientist. and explain what had happened. I just debated Joe, and this is the conversation we had. I've looked at the testimony, and looks like Joe's right. So what am I missing? Because I was certain I was missing something. And it turned out I wasn't missing anything. It became clear to me in the course of the back and forth that he was knowingly misleading people with that narrative that he had offered, that I had offered on television. But it was from that point forward that I began to do a little bit more of the due diligence that I should have been doing all along with regard to the scientific narratives I was offering. Sometimes it wasn't conscious disingenuousness. Sometimes it was just cherry-picked data that were easy to knock apart. Sometimes you would find that the papers, which looked so impressive, were never published in a peer-reviewed journal, though it looks like they were published in a peer-reviewed journal, but they weren't. If you bothered to look at the response to the paper, you'd find it get shot full of holes. But these are things which I had never done in the past. And when I began to do that due diligence, which I should have been doing in the past, I found that the story I just told you played itself out over and over and over and again.
We presented Taylor's critique to Patrick Michaels, who rejects Taylor's account. He says his facts were scientifically documented, and he still thinks James Hansen is wrong and denies misleading the public. Cato has not replied to the critique in spite of repeated requests.
Near the end of my time at the Cato Institute, when I found that I couldn't avoid the climate conversation because I was in charge of their, energy and environmental operation. I can't totally avoid it, but I was uncomfortable making the older arguments. It was the Lomborgian arguments that I had forwarded.
Okay, hold it there. The Lomborgian argument. Danish Bjørn Lomborg. Why does Taylor mention him? In an op-ed in the Politiken newspaper in 1998, Bjørn Lomborg writes, "The greenhouse effect is dubious." After that, Lomborg gathered momentum. He came to play a major role, not only in the Danish, but also the international climate debate. And according to Jerry Taylor, the Lomborgian argument sounds something like this.
You want to spend $10 trillion or $20 trillion to decarbonize the global economy, that's money not being spent on some other possible worthy engagement that might better human well-being. And that was the argument that Bjørn Lomborg has long trafficked in. And one that's not insane. I mean, it's the right way to think about it.
Taylor's not the only one who quotes Bjørn Lomborg.
That's the estimate by Bjørn Lomborg, a Danish statistician, looking at this.
I think the work he does is outstanding. We both agree that the costs of addressing global warming are colossal, and they're much larger than the damages caused by the claimed impacts of warming.
Lomborg did not want to participate in this documentary, but emphasizes that he believes in man-made climate change. Now he calls his original statement on the greenhouse effect clumsy. Now, back to where we interrupted Jerry in his final days at Cato.
It was the Lomborgian arguments that I had forwarded. But I lost faith in those too, because if you look at the higher end scenario of the full distribution of possible outcomes from climate change, because we don't know how it's going to play out exactly. We know it won't be good, but we don't know if it's only going to be modestly bad or apocalyptically off the charts sci-fi horror bad. It could be any of these things. If you look at that full distribution of possible outcomes, it's virtually impossible to oppose climate action.
Let's take a look at the economics. The oil industry strategy paper describes how large sums of money are to be given by the oil and energy industry to think tanks and organizations. Among recipients are CFACT, where Mark Morano works.
The best thing to do is have the courage to do nothing.
Do you get any money from the oil companies?
We might get some.
And Competitive Enterprise Institute.
We don't disclose our donors. However, some of our donors disclose that they fund us, the most notable being Mobil, which funded a number of groups for probably a decade.
Tax records, financial reports, and other documents show who ExxonMobil funded after the strategy meeting from 1998 to 2006. The data shows that the world's major oil company, in the years after the meeting, donated at least $12 million, and probably much more, to climate-critical organizations and think tanks. And they're not the only ones funding the skeptics. An American research project has mapped out how other oil companies and many wealthy conservatives have donated billions to climate skeptics. So scientists and pundits alike have been paid by the oil industry. Does this influence their work? One such climate skeptic, Steve Milloy, who was present at the API meeting, has described his relationship with the industry like this.
Are you in bed with big oil? And if so, how good in bed are they?
Not in bed with anyone, just trying to do the right thing on climate change.
Myron Ebel also rejects that the oil money his think tank receives has any influence.
We develop our policies based on what we think are based on our principles and what we think the evidence and the facts are. Once we've done that, we try to find funding for it. So if someone wants to fund us, I would like to find a lot more funding for what we do.
Then there's Fred Singer, the man behind the Leipzig Declaration. The Danish Broadcasting Corporation investigated that list in 1997.
Mange af de europæiske underskrivere siger til os, at de slet ikke har skrevet under. All the European scientists, there are 15 of them that say that they are not climate scientists.
I have not seen any evidence for that.
But they have told us, we've talked to everyone, they said they are not climate scientists.
What's your question?
I mean, you present them as climate scientists.
I was told they were climate scientists.
Fred Singer's organization, SEPP, which is behind the list, well, they also received money from ExxonMobil.
The oil industry was a main bankroller and cheerleader for opposition to climate action. Their financial support of the climate skeptics in the scientific community ensured that we had the references and the citations that we needed to make a credible argument.
Is the Earth getting warmer? And there's a lot of discussion about that.
Is it?
The answer to that is in some places yes, and in others no.
Patrick Michaels doesn't want to comment on the critique that he has received money from the oil industry. Climate skeptical scientist Willie Soon didn't respond to the critique that he's been paid by the industry. Fred Singer's lawyer has been presented with the critique of Singer, but hasn't replied. And Steve Milloy dropped an interview at short notice and has declined to comment on the critique. Many of them have previously said that their research isn't influenced by money from, for instance, the oil industry.
This is all about deflection. It's all about distraction. You know, Jim Hansen is here telling you the truth about climate change, and they're saying, oh, don't look at Jim Hansen, look at me over here. Pay attention to this report that I wrote that claims that we don't really know if there's climate change. So it's all about distraction, deflection, to create confusion, to create smoke and mirrors so that people don't really know what's going on. And then they say, I don't know, I don't know what to think. I'm just going to get my kids to soccer.
The oil industry's strategy of sowing doubt, has it been done before?
I believe nicotine is not addictive, yes.
Mr. Johnston.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no.
In the mid-1900s, scientists realized that smoking was dangerous. The tobacco industry made every effort to counteract the new knowledge. An internal document says, "Doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public." The industry succeeded in delaying regulation of tobacco for decades. That successful campaign was now copied by climate skeptics. When science established the danger of smoking tobacco, companies published ads against it. Oil companies did the same after James Hansen's presentation.
So the idea is to make it seem that we don't really know for sure if this is a problem, because if we don't know, then it would be premature to allow the government to, say, regulate tobacco. And then the same argument is used on climate change.
And who did this for the tobacco industry? Some of the scientists and pundits who indirectly or directly got money from the tobacco industry reappear in the climate debate. One of the first prominent climate skeptics was Frederick Seitz. Many years before, he headed research projects for the tobacco industry.
In the 60s, the tobacco company very clearly said that there wasn't a direct linkage.
If people wanted to believe that, it was their own doing.
But do you think that was also political on the part of the tobacco companies?
Well, they wanted to keep up sales.
Yeah. Was it irresponsible on the part of the tobacco companies?
It was irresponsible on the part of the smokers.
And Fred Singer co-authored a report downplaying the danger of passive smoking. The pundit Steve Malloy, who was present at the API meeting, concurrently worked for both tobacco and oil companies. And the organization, which Myron Ebel directed politically, also worked for the tobacco industry. And Jerry Taylor?
The arguments that I made at the time, it was that when it comes to secondhand smoke, that the epidemiological evidence that had been forward was not particularly persuasive. But the fact is the same kind of arguments, the same stylized arguments that were made against action to regulate tobacco are pretty similar to the arguments that we used against climate change.
But what did the industry know about climate change when it launched this campaign? The answer can be found on board a ship off the coast of Texas in 1979. A man on the ship did something so important to Exxon that this presentation film was produced for the company's management. The man was Ed Garvey, and today he looks like this.
The videotapes were taken to show to the corporate board about this really exciting research project that the company was doing to study the impacts of increased CO2 on the planet and contribute to the science of climate change.
40 years ago, almost 10 years before James Hansen's speech, an internal scientific department at Exxon researched global warming.
They funded the project because they thought the science was important, they thought Exxon needed to be involved, and they were concerned about climate change.
Ed Garvey passed his measurements on to the scientists who analyzed data.
The scientists at Exxon, the modelers, the mathematicians, and the physicists were modeling climate change, modeling the impacts of increased CO2 in the atmosphere, and they were very clear that they knew that CO2 increase was changing the climate on the planet.
On its website, ExxonMobil says its data on climate change was published in scientific journals. However, Exxon fails to mention the ads it later put out, calling the science unsettled.
I mean, the ads that they put out, I don't think anyone in their scientific division could support them as a scientist and say, yeah, these are truthful facts that we're putting out. I think that the statements they were making were clearly misleading and designed to mislead people.
So while the oil industry publicly spread doubts, internal documents show that its own scientists had warned of global warming. In this 1978 confidential report for Exxon's management, a senior scientist says it's scientifically accepted that fossil fuels influence climate. He also writes that within 5 to 10 years, humanity may have to make tough decisions in this field. A few years later, in 1981, the head of Exxon's research department warns that the consequences of global warming may be catastrophic for a substantial fraction of the Earth's population. That was almost 40 years ago. Yet, Exxon's CEO later says this on TV.
There is a natural variability that has nothing to do with man.
What would that be?
The climate has changed every year for millions of years.
Another oil company also knew early on that climate change was underway. In the 80s, Shell's scientists warned of alarming consequences. When the global warming becomes detectable, it could be too late to do anything or to stabilize the situation. Yet, for decades, Shell has continued to finance organizations that spread doubts about climate science.
The global warming is now large enough that we can ascribe.
If the oil industry, after the Hansen testimony, had said, you know, we're not going to argue with James Hansen because we think he's right, we think this is correct. Had they done that, it would have cut the legs out of climate denialism and skepticism, right? Well, if you can't even persuade ExxonMobil it's hooey, then I'm not sure why I should listen to you, right? But that's not what happened.
As a human being, and as a father and grandfather, and hopefully a great-grandfather someday, I'm really scared for our children and their future. We start to deal with changes on a planetary scale. We can't just turn around and go back the other way. Okay, you can, I mean, from my own experience, you can clean a river, you can clean an estuary, clean a lake, you can do, reset it, so to speak. We don't get a reset button on the planet. We don't get a reset button, and that's really frightening. We don't get a reset button, and it's really scary.
Great shot up there.
ExxonMobil denies withholding data on climate change. Its website states that the risks of climate change are real and that ExxonMobil's research has been published in scientific journals. We'd like to ask ExxonMobil why it funded climate skeptics and in ads and statements has cast doubts on climate science. But Exxon did not answer these questions and declined an interview. We'd also like to ask API about the critique that it spreads doubt about climate science. But API hasn't replied nor agreed to an interview. ExxonMobil and API write that they are working on technologies that may reduce climate change. They've also said this in commercials.
Plants capture CO2. What if other kinds of plants captured it too?
Reduced carbon emission levels to the lowest in a generation. Let's make tomorrow better together.
Beyond darkness, light. Beyond petroleum, BP.
But how green are the oil companies actually today? We asked the world's 5 largest oil companies how much they invest in green technology and how much they invest in extracting fossil fuels. Shell answers that it now spends 5% of investments on green technologies. The French oil company Total says it spends 10%. BP, Chevron and ExxonMobil did not answer. So we asked Influence Map, an organization who analyzes key climate issue figures to review their investments. The figures show that all three oil companies are at the low end, and Chevron is at less than 1%. The combined figures show that the world's 5 largest oil companies' fossil fuel investments are at 95% on average.
I think it's fair to say that the climate change deniers have won. That in 1988, Jim Hansen tells us that climate change is underway. So if it had not been for the denial campaigns, I think it's pretty clear the political momentum was there, the political will was there.
They have succeeded in preventing climate action for several decades, where it would have occurred earlier had it not been for their efforts.
Today, we could be living in a world where 60, 80, maybe even 90% of our energy would be from renewable energy. We've had 30 years, that's a lot of time to make technological change. And we'd also be living in a different world politically. And in some ways, maybe this is even the more horrible thing about the effects of what these folks did. They made disinformation mainstream. They made it okay for the President of the United States to say that climate change was a hoax.
My name is Myron Ebell, and I'm
leading the Trump transition team on environmental matters is an avid climate change denier.
Well, Mr. Trump, when he ran for president, I did the Environmental Protection Agency. I was the leader of that team.